All right, it's recording now. Thanks.
Okay, so Emiliano, thank you for the invitation to share our latest paper, as well as for the nice introduction. So as Emiliano just mentioned, I'm going to talk by one of our latest papers, namely on synthetic data, where we ask the question if synthetic data is a privacy mirage. This work is done in collaboration with Teresa and Carmela from EPFL. So first, let's start with a bit of background. So we have that data sharing, like everybody wants to share data because it profoundly impacts both the pace and the scope of international research collaboration, as well as data-driven research discovery. And in fact, for example, in the case of genomic data, even funding agencies like the National Institute of Health make data sharing a requirement to fund grant application. So in the scenario we consider, we look at a data controller that has a sensitive raw data set R. What he wants to do is that he wants to use that raw data set such that an analyst can draw significant statistical insights from that specific data. The problem is that if an analyst can draw those statistical insights, then so can an attacker. So the goal of the data, basically the goal of the data controller now is to find some anonymization mechanism, which we would say that a silver bullet such an anonymization mechanism that ideally would output a sanitized version of the raw data, in this case R prime, and the sanitized data sets should essentially be a copy of the raw data set R, from which an analyst with whom we want to share this data can still draw the statistical insights. However, we want that the transformations that were applied to that data would prevent the adversary from inferring any sensitive information about individual records in the data set. And so far, we have seen many data release disasters. So one example is the AOL data release when they released a compressed text file of one of its websites, which contained search keywords for a lot of usernames, and in fact, even for a lot of users over a 3-month period. And in fact, even they came afterwards and admitted that this was a screw up. Also, we have that study finds that HIPAA protected data is still at risk. So it basically showed that patients' personal records in hospitals could still be re-identified even when data identifiers such as names and addresses were removed. And of course, you might all be aware about the Netflix prize that it was in fact canceled after concerns were raised about privacy. And there are many other data release disasters. And in fact, there have been research lately that actually said that anonymized data can never be totally anonymous, and that anonymized data is even less anonymous than we thought. So the problem so far is that anonymization strategies that the community has tried up to date, such as generalization or perturbation, have been shown to be ineffective. So the next step is that what if we look at synthetic data? And in fact, there are a lot of startups in this space, such as, for example, Mostly AI, which tells you that you can democratize your data access with synthetic data, and it will guarantee you that you get no more fines. Another company, Status, tells you that it offers data anonymization solution that enables businesses to stay innovative, but at the same time do so in a privacy compliant manner. Then Hazy, another one, would let you generate synthetic data and lets you create business insight across companies, legal and compliance boundaries. And then another one is Synthesized, which actually promises you that with synthesized data, you'll get 10 times the impact with 0 risks. And they also claim that they solve the problem of data sharing. And instead of sharing the original data, they enable businesses to work with compliant synthetic data, mimicking the structure of original data without disclosing any information about individual data points. And that's not all. In fact, even the National Institute of Standards and Technology has had a competition 2 years ago, I think, called the Privacy Synthetic Data Challenge, where teams were competing to propose to develop differentially private synthetic algorithms such to enable the protection of personally identifiable information while maintaining the data set's utility. And even and more recently, we have that DODI leads, together with NHS England, announced that they will be working together to explore the potential of synthetic data. And they say that this data has been created following the patterns identified in a real data set, but it contains no personal data, which would make it suitable to release as an open data. So let's take a step back and ask, what is synthetic data? Synthetic data is mostly created using generative models. And a generative model is a statistical model that gives a raw data set, that given a raw data set R, would learn an approximation of the distribution. And then from that trained model, we can generate the synthetic data set by sampling from that learned distribution. And the promise of synthetic data is that it still allows us to get statistical insights. However, privacy adversaries cannot exploit the knowledge they had before in terms of privacy. So in the work that we've done and that I'm presenting today, we challenged the fact whether it's really true that the privacy awarded by synthetic data is as perfect as advertised, and basically asked the question, is a generative model, is synthetic data the silver bullet that we were looking for in terms of data sharing? And to be more exact, the question that we asked in our work is, does publishing a synthetic data set in place of a raw data set mitigate the privacy risks of data publishing? And in order to answer this question, we need a privacy evaluation framework that first is specific to the data sharing scenario, is interpretable and can be linked to relevant data protection regulations, and treats the privacy mechanism as a black box and thus can be applied to any kind of generative model. And first, again, we take another step back right now to look at what previous work has been done on the privacy of generative models. And previous work on this topic basically failed to address some of the requirements that we just said, and they normally make some assumption regarding about the generative model, or they don't consider the data sharing scenario, but look at it more as a machine learning problem in which a model can be queried many times. So basically the adversaries normally assume to have some sort of access to the generative model, and they aim to extract as much information from that from the model. And in our work, what we do is we assume that the data publisher published the type of training algorithm, but not the trained model. So basically, we suggest a framework in which we would measure the privacy gain of publishing the synthetic data set in place of the raw data set with respect to a specific privacy concern implemented by the privacy adversary. And our framework aims to test the hypothesis that if the generative model is a good privacy mechanism, then the expected risk of publishing the raw data should be reduced by publishing the synthetic data. And this reduction in risk that I'm talking about for a target record is what we will call, what we will define as publishing gain of publishing the synthetic data set in place of the raw data set. And basically, we define the adversary this way, since we think about how we define utility. When you propose a new generative model that generates synthetic data, when you try to compare it in terms of utility with the results on the raw data set. So if we do this for utility purposes, why not compare it in the same way for privacy? And in fact, we think it's a pretty simple idea, but we still have to quantify a few metrics. So then we can actually measure that privacy gain. The first step is that we want to assess the privacy gain to a specific privacy concern about a potential disclosure of a secret associated with the target individual record. So basically, given a data set and a target record, if you have a privacy adversary, that privacy adversary will aim to guess a secret association with the record, with this record, the target record. And we think that this is an important property of the framework because we want the framework to be interpretable and be able to be relevant in the data holder's context. And we model a privacy concern as an adversary that optimizes the strategy to infer the secret of a specific target. And for each of the adversary, first define the prior probability of the target secret for any adversary. So that is given general information, what is the probability that that secret is true? And then we also look at the probability of success for the same adversary. However, now he has access to a given data set, call it X. And now, if we want to define the individual private loss, we define it for a target record under an adversary given access to the data set as the difference between the probability when the adversary has access to the data set X minus the prior probability. And in our framework, the privacy loss will have values between -1 and 1, where a privacy loss of 1 means that publishing X substantially improves the adversary's chance of success. Privacy loss of -1 means that publishing the data set X reduces the adversary's chance of success. And if we get the privacy loss to be 0, it means that publishing the data set X does not give the adversary any advantage over her pride. And now, going back again on how we say that we want to define our privacy adversary, we can compute the privacy loss for the raw data set and the privacy loss for the synthetic data set. And thus, we use those two metrics in order to compute the privacy gain, which we computed as the difference between the privacy loss given by the raw data set minus the privacy loss given by the synthetic data. And we factor this by 2, such that the privacy gain will have a value between -1 and 1, where we have that if the privacy gain is 0, means that publishing the synthetic data gives equal privacy to the target as publishing the raw data. If the privacy gain is greater than 0, means that publishing the synthetic data set instead of the real data improves the target's privacy. And if the privacy gain is smaller than 0, it means that publishing S actually leaks more information about the target than when we publish the raw data. So note that the privacy loss and gain can be computed independently of the generative model that generated the data. And in fact, the raw data set can be replaced by any reference data set, as for example, you can replace it by a sanitized version of the real data. So now that we have our metrics, we need to specify the privacy threats. So in our work, we implement and instantiate the framework with respect to 2 of the most relevant risks in data publishing, namely the risk of attribute inference and the risk of membership inference. And now, just a bit of background, in our evaluation framework, we used 5 generative models. We tested on data generated by 5 generative models, 3 of which do not have any explicit privacy protection, and which are an independent histogram model, a Bayesian network model, and CT-GAN, which is a GAN-based model that uses mode-specific normalization of tabular data attributes to improve the approximation of complex distribution, and 2 models designed to offer a differential privacy, namely PrivBase, which is a differentially private Bayesian network model, and PATE-GAN, a model that builds on the PATE framework in order to achieve differential privacy for GANs. And we tested our framework on 3 different data sets, namely the adult data set, which contains census data from the US, Texas data set, which contains patient discharge information, and German credit, which is normally used to see if a person has good or bad credit based on some features regarding its previous history in terms of credit. So now let's look about the two attacks that I've mentioned. So if we look at attribute inference attack, in a nutshell, it is that given some public information of some user, we want to infer some private attributes of the target users. And in our evaluation, to be more specific, we focus on a sensitive attribute that will take values in a continuous domain. And first, what we do is that we train our adversary model. So during training, we would have an adversary would take a data set R, it would split it into a feature matrix RK, which is the part that it would be known, and the target variable RS. And then we would use the maximum likelihood estimation in order to obtain a set of regression coefficients, which is defined in, which is shown in line 2. It then will output an attack function that without any further input will return the result of applying the learned linear coefficients to the target record. And in this algorithm, if instead of the raw data set, the adversary is given access to a synthetic data set, the adversary would obtain the linear coefficients in regards to the synthetic data set. And then the second algorithm we define is the AI gain, which basically would take as an input a model training procedure, the adversary's training algorithm, which is algorithm 1, the data set R and the target record T with attribute indices for the known and the secret attributes, and the number of synthetic data test data sets, which we call NS. The first thing that we do is that we split the target record into partial record known to the adversary and the target secret, that's line 1 of the algorithm. We then run the adversary's training procedure on the raw data sets and fit the generative model to the data set. We then sample NS synthetic data sets from the generative model and train a privacy adversary on each of them. And finally, we calculate the expected privacy gain as the difference between the adversary's chance of success given R and the average probability of success given S, which is shown in line 7. So what were our experimental results for this first adversary? First of all, we compared the privacy gain for 50 randomly chosen targets across 25 test runs. And we fixed the set of target records, and in every run, we sampled the new training cohort. And these are the results that we obtained. And the plots shown here show that the expected gain of publishing a synthetic data set in place of the raw data is actually close to 0 across all data sets, sensitive attributes, generative models, and targets. And in fact, we found that for 70% of all cases, the expected privacy gain is less than 0.01, which would suggest that publishing the synthetic data instead of the raw data does not change the adversary's probability of success for these targets. And the only attacks that we saw on the middle plot, namely for the Texas data set length of stay attribute, we observed a slight variance in the expected gain. And in this case, the expected gain for 66% of the target is larger than 0.02 for models trained using the independent histogram algorithm. And while 6% of the target records will have a small negative gain. And also we found that if a CT-GAN trained model is used, then the ratio of targets with a small positive gain decreases to 0%. So we also, in order to illustrate what this variation means, we also want to visualize the adversary's posterior distribution over the secret of an example target in the Texas dataset for a fixed data set, a training data set, and the sensitive attribute length of stay. And here, the blue line shows the value of the raw data when computed on raw data. The red line shows the value of the secret when computed on the synthetic data, and the yellow is the true value of the target secret. We observed that the adversary's posterior, after observing the raw data, is closely centered around the target's true secret. And in comparison, the adversary guess is shifted away from the true value after observing the synthetic data produced by the an independent histogram trained model, which is the left plot. But less so if the synthetic data is sampled for a model trained through CT-GAN. And what this can indicate is the fact that independent histogram trained models do not accurately preserve the linear relationships between known and sensitive attributes contained in the raw data that would in fact allow an attacker to correctly infer the target secret. And now what do these results mean? So, So we think that these results demonstrate that synthetic data is not, as promised by many, a privacy mechanism without any trade-offs. And protection from attribute inference can only be achieved if the model does not accurately reproduce all correlations found in the raw data. And if these correlations are preserved, the privacy gain of publishing the synthetic data instead of the raw data is negligible. And probably you might think, but this is what we want for synthetic data. We want it to be able to have the same utility that you'd get from the raw data. So maybe we actually want attribute inference, but at the same time, we also have to think about the privacy that might occur when releasing those synthetic data sets. So now moving on to our next adversary, which is an adversary for a membership inference attack. So in the case of membership inference, we have that we have a privacy adversary that, given access to a synthetic data set and a target record, it would output whether the target was used to train the model that generated the synthetic data set or not. So I think that here, rather than go through the algorithm, it might be easier to show you a bit of a graph, a plot. So basically what we do for our membership inference adversary, we use the shadow modeling technique, which was originally introduced by Chokri, in order to implement our membership inference adversary. So that means we take a reference data set, RA, and the first thing we do is we split it into n samples, which may or may not overlap. Then we take the target record, and we add that target record to all of those n data sets. And then for each copy of the data set, we train a generative model, one with on the raw data set without the target, and one on the raw data set with the target. From there, we sample a set of synthetic data sets, and we'll label those accordingly as in or out, depending if the data set that was used to train the model contained the target record or not. And sorry, and we do so for all the other n models. And now the labeled data sets will be used as training examples for our attack model. And basically a binary classifier that will learn to predict whether a given synthetic data set was generated using a data from a model trained using a data set with the target in it or without. And now basically the adversary, given access to a new synthetic data set, would output whether the specific target was or wasn't in the data set. And for completeness, these are the algorithms which basically describe what I just showed you. Now let's move on to the privacy gate. So now we have the assumption, we have an assumption that we have an equal prior of 0.5, which is exactly the random guess baseline, especially in the case of membership inference. And we also know that the adversary that has access to the raw data set can say whether the target was or wasn't in the raw data set with probability 1. Therefore, we adjust our privacy gain formula in this case to be 1 minus the probability of the MIA correctly predicting whether the target was present in the data set or not. And for this, the privacy gain value will be slightly shifted. We will have a privacy gain value between 0 and 0.5, where 0 means that publishing the synthetic data is equivalent to publishing R, and we have that MIA probability of 1. If the privacy gain is 0.25, we have that publishing the synthetic data set gives the adversary no advantage over random guessing. And if we have the privacy gain of 0.5, we have that publishing S reduces the adversary's chance of success. And now, the first thing I have to mention is that in our attack setup, we also used feature extraction because we want the adversary to be able to distinguish between the two distributions, the one with the target and the one without the target. And in order to reduce the effect of high dimensionality and sampling uncertainty, we say that the adversary can apply some feature extraction techniques before training the classifier. And now, basically, we can define a more strategic membership inference attack in order that looks also at the feature vector that was extracted from the synthetic data set. And we use in our evaluation, we use 4 feature sets, namely a naive feature set that would compute the mean, median, and variance of each numerical attribute, and then we'll encode the number of distinct categories for plus the most and least, the most frequent and least frequent category for each categorical attribute, an histogram feature set that computes the marginal distribution for each data attribute, and where the numerical attributes are binned, and then we compute the frequency count for the categorical attributes, a correlation feature set that encodes the pairwise attribute correlations, and finally an ensemble feature sets, which combines the 2 feature vectors which are outputted by the histogram feature set and the correlations feature set. So our first set of results, we basically sample a target randomly from the data set, and as before, we do multiple tests as before. And what we find is that for all 3 generative models without explicit privacy protection, we found that the expected privacy gain is less than the random guess baseline for between 48% and 58% of the targets, depending on the feature sets. And in fact, we find that for CT GAN trained models, that they provide the least, which is the right-hand side plot, they provide the least protection, where 24% of the targets have a privacy gain of less than 0.2 under an attacker focusing on a naive feature set. And that would be equivalent to a MIA accuracy of 60%. And then we also find that the attacker's feature extraction plays an important role. So if we look at the fraction of targets with low privacy gain for the bayonet, which is the middle plot, we see that it is increased. The fraction of targets with low privacy gain is increased from, I think, 54% to around 58% if the attacker uses the correlation feature set instead of the histogram feature set. And we also think that the high variance in the record privacy gain across training sets for a fixed target actually demonstrate that it's the combination of training set and target record that would in fact determine whether the target has a detectable influence on the data features preserved by the model. So the conclusion of this is that while some records receive good protection from synthetic data publishing, others can remain vulnerable to membership inference attacks. The second set of experiments we've done for this attack was the results was to look at an outlier target, and we actually crafted our own outlier target as a worst case scenario. What we did is that for each categorical attribute, we assign probability 1 to the least frequent category in the original data set. And for the numerical attributes, we assign the probability 1 to the maximum attribute value. And as before, we find that there is a high variance across data sets, attack classifier, and feature sets, but overall, there are many data points below the expected privacy gain. We also see that the choice of feature set has a strong influence on the target's privacy gain. And for both adult and Texas data sets, focusing on correlation reduces the target's privacy gain. And also, I'm just showing here the results for random forest classifier, but we've done our experiments on other classifiers such as a linear regression and KNN model. So another surprising thing that we found by looking at this plot is that attacks on the crafted target are most successful when focusing on the correlation feature set, which are the yellow dots, even for models that do not explicitly model correlation. And overall, it depends on the data set, the generative model type, and the attacker strategy. But on average, we find that the privacy gain is lower than expected. So it's basically the attacker success is going to be higher than 50%. So we think that a strategic adversary that chooses the right features to mount the attack has high chances of success and can perform substantially better than the baseline. And again, what do the results of our experiments show? Is that while some records receive good protection from synthetic data publishing, others remain vulnerable to linkage attacks. And we think that this is a problem because in order to have a good privacy mechanism, it has to be predictable. So you have to be able to say for sure that it receives some privacy protection. And we saw that it's not possible to predict the privacy gain for a particular target without fixing the entire training set. And in fact, the high variance that we saw in the average privacy gain across target records indicates that the model tends to amplify the signal of some records in the training set while it actually hides the presence of others, which means that it gives disparate protection. So probably right now you're going to think that, okay, but we have generative models that have explicit privacy protection built into them. So we look now at DP generative models. And again, we ask the same question. Is this the silver bullet we were looking for? And before I go any further, just a quick example of differential privacy. So ideally, if you have two data sets, one which has Alice's record and one which has Bob's record, you want to do some computation of that on them. You basically add some noise, and then when you would output the results of those computation, somebody looking at those can't really know if those computations were done on the data set containing Alice's data or on the data set containing Bob's data. And going back to our attack, now so the first thing we did, as before, we looked at the attribute inference. And we saw that for priv-based, the differentially private training results in a slight increase in privacy gain compared to the case when it doesn't have explicit privacy protection. So here it's the case when epsilon goes to infinity. And the fraction of targets that have a privacy gain greater than 0.02 increases from 46% to 92% when the privacy parameter decreases from epsilon equals to 1 to epsilon equals to 0.01. And however, the problem is that even under differentially private training with epsilon equals to 0.01, the maximum gain achieved by any one target is 0.03, which is a very moderate decrease in the attacker's success rate. And now, we did the same. Membership inference on the DP models. However, this time we focused on the outlier target. And it's a bit unexpected that neither differentially private training leads to an increase in the average record privacy gain for any of the attack feature sets tested. And we found that linkage is still possible even under small epsilon values. And it was especially surprising that synthetic data produced by the priv-based models that provide differential privacy for attribute correlations extracted from the raw data would be vulnerable to membership inference using a correlations feature set. And we think that this implies that even under differentially private training, the model preserves correlations from the raw data that are impacted by the target's presence, and the attack is still able to leverage. And again, what does this mean? So it means that differentially private noise addition may hide some of the linear relationships that enable attribute inference attack. But at the same time, by adding the noise, it will reduce the utility of the data. And that we think that the privacy guarantees for the lower dimensional representation of the input data learned by the differentially private models do not necessarily extend to all features of the high dimensional synthetic data sampled from these models. So now, of course, the next question that came into our minds and probably to yours by now is, why are generative models poor privacy mechanism? So far we showed that synthetic data does not provide a magical trade-off free mechanism for privacy preserving data publishing. And any dimensions in the synthetic data that closely mimic the raw data feature increase the utility of the data, but at the same time, it would allow targeted inference about individual training records. So here, the first question that we asked is, what if we can predict features preserved by the generative models? So what we do here, what we do in order to observe this is that we fix a target record and sample a fixed training set. And for each data set, we ran 25 test runs in which we take the same data set and train two models, one with the target and one without the target. And then we sample multiple copies of synthetic data from both models and assess the privacy gain under random forest attack for 3 different feature sets. And this experiment shows that the target's privacy gain depends on the third factor that it's not under the data publisher's control, which is the feature set that the adversary chooses. And the level of protection a generative model provides depends on how much information the model's output leaks about the features targeted by the attack. And this means that we can only predict privacy gain if we can predict what features a potential adversary would target, and if we know which data characteristics will be preserved. And in practice, none of these factors is predictable. And in fact, synthetic data effectively preserves a large set of data characteristics which are not constrained to the features explicitly represented by a model. So even with the entire training cohort fixed under the same model training algorithm, the target's estimated privacy gain varies across model training runs and across feature sets. And the next question is more specific to differential privacy, is what features does the differential privacy preserve? And we saw previously that even for small epsilon, membership inference adversary is able to identify some feature in the model's output that significantly change when the target is present in the data. And like going by the definitions of differential privacy, this is really counterintuitive because differentially private model training should bound the changes in output when adding a single target to the input data to a small ratio defined by epsilon. And a possible explanation for this is that the differentially private guarantee provided by these models only covers a limited set of features in the model's lower dimensional approximation. And thus, an adversary may be able to identify features in the model's high dimensional outputs that are not covered by the guarantees and that allow to infer the target's membership. So the next thing we've done in order to observe this is that we tried to modify, to change the shadow models that the adversary trains in order to deploy, in order to get the privacy gain. And what we do is that first we use we use as shadow model the Bayesian network, and then try to see what the privacy gain is both on the Bayesian network and on the Bayesian network with differential privacy. And we find that such an attack under the correlation feature set is still very successful on the Bayesian net, as you can see, especially for the correlation feature set, which are the yellow points on the plot, on the left-hand side plot. And the target's expected gain, in fact, will increase for synthetic data produced by a priv-based model with epsilon equals to 0.01. And when we do the opposite, that is, we use as shadow model the priv-base, we see something similar happening in the case of the Bayesian network, which has no DP, and that the priv-based model provides next to no protection against an adversary trained on the differentially private shadow model. So that is the case for the right-hand side plot, where we train with the priv-base and we tested on the priv-base with epsilon equals to 0.01. And finally, the key takeaways that I want to get through from our paper is that we think that synthetic data does not enable data sharing without loss in utility or privacy. And any small gain in privacy comes at a cost of utility. We think that highly dimensional synthetic data sets often carry more information about their training data than what is captured by the generative model. And we think that our results show that differential privacy provides little protection against membership machine learning-based inference attacks on high-dimensional data sets. And the last key takeaway from our paper is, again, we try to answer the question whether generative models and synthetic data is the silver bullet that we're looking for. And our conclusions from our paper is that, in fact, it's not. Because, as I said before, a good privacy mechanism has to be predictable. And we found that the privacy gain, quite a big variation in the privacy gain across the experiments that we've done so far. And before I go on to question, we have our framework implemented, so you can find the GitHub link under Spring DPFL. And these are the blocks that we used to build our algorithm, which I won't go through now because I can see that we only have a few minutes left. So if you want to play with the code, feel free to go on GitHub and take it and look at it. And other than that, I'm happy to take questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Brice. I'm gonna pause the recording and then everyone can ask questions.
So I don't know if there was anything on the chat. I haven't monitored it.
Yeah, there was one question by Martin. So